What if I told you that the greatest disaster in human history wasn't a war? It wasn't a plague. It wasn't a meteor crashing into the earth. It was a seed, a tiny, unremarkable grain, pressed into the dirt by a hand that had no idea what it was about to unleash. 12,000 years ago, somewhere in what we now call the Middle East, a group of humans made a choice. Or maybe the choice was made for them. Either way, they traded something priceless for something that looked like progress. They traded freedom for grain, equality for surplus, and the open sky for the walls of the first villages. That single shift, from wandering the earth to farming it, didn't just change what humans ate. It changed who they were to each other. It created the rich and the poor, the rulers and the ruled, the priests, the soldiers, the slaves. Every hierarchy you see around you today, every ladder you've been told to climb, every system that separates the powerful from the powerless, all of it traces back to that moment, to a seed pushed into the ground by someone who thought they were building a better life. Before you go any further, if you're new here, take a moment to subscribe. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next. And while you're at it, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I want to know where in the world this story is reaching. Because this is a story about all of us. Every single one of us, alive today, carries the consequences of that ancient decision. Tonight, we're going all the way back, before civilization, before kings, before money, before gods had temples. We're going to walk through the world as it was when humans were equal, truly equal. And then we're going to watch, step by step, how that equality was shattered. Not by a conqueror, not by a tyrant, but by wheat. So settle in. This is a long one. And it's going to change the way you see the world you live in. Let's start with something that might surprise you. For most of human history, and I mean the overwhelming majority of it, people didn't farm. They didn't build cities. They didn't have bosses, landlords, or tax collectors. They wandered, they hunted, they gathered. And by almost every measure we have, they lived well. If you compressed all of human existence into a single 24-hour day, agriculture wouldn't arrive until 6 minutes before midnight. 6 minutes. That means for 23 hours and 54 minutes, humans survived and often thrived, without planting a single crop, without owning a single piece of land, without anyone telling them what they were worth. The hunter-gatherers of the Paleolithic were not the desperate, starving savages that old textbooks liked to describe. That image, the caveman gnawing on a bone, constantly on the edge of death, is a myth. A comfortable myth that makes us feel better about the world we built after. But the archaeological record tells a very different story. Their bodies were remarkable. The average man stood around 5 feet 10. The average woman around 5'6". They were tall. They were strong. Their bones show the kind of robust health that comes from constant movement, varied diet, and open air. Their teeth were largely free of cavities because they weren't grinding their way through mountains of carbohydrate-heavy grain. Their joints were sound. Their spines were straight. These were bodies shaped by a life of balance, not excess, not deprivation, but something in between. When anthropologists examine the skeletons of Paleolithic hunter-gatherers and compare them to modern athletes, the similarities are striking. These people weren't just healthy. They were fit. They moved constantly over varied terrain, using every muscle group. Their bones were dense and strong, their frames built to last. And then, in just a few generations, all of that collapsed. And the food they ate was extraordinary in its variety. Dozens of different plants, fruits, nuts, roots, tubers, seeds, insects, small game, large game, fish, shellfish, a rotating menu that shifted with the seasons and the landscape. Nutritional studies of the few remaining hunter-gatherer societies show diets that are richer in protein, more balanced in vitamins and minerals, and more varied than anything most modern humans eat. We think of our supermarkets as temples of abundance, but a forager in the Paleolithic had access to a wider range of nutrients than most people filling their carts in the processed food aisle today. And here's the thing that really overturns everything we've been taught. They didn't work very hard. Research on groups like the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert and the Hadza of Tanzania showed that hunter-gatherers spent somewhere between 12 and 19 hours per week obtaining food. That's it. 12 to 19 hours. The rest of their time was spent socializing, playing, resting, storytelling, making art. When one researcher asked a Bushman why his people hadn't adopted farming like their neighbors, the man looked at him and essentially said, "Why would we, when the land already provides everything we need?" Think about that. In a world without alarm clocks, without commutes, without quarterly reports or performance reviews, human beings had more leisure time than most of us do today. They worked 2 or 3 hours a day to eat, and spent the rest of their time being human. But it wasn't just the food and the free time. It was the structure of their societies, or rather, the lack of structure. These were profoundly egalitarian communities. There were no permanent leaders. No one accumulated wealth, because there was nothing to accumulate. You can't hoard berries, and there's no point stockpiling meat when you'll be moving camp in a few days. Decisions were made collectively. Resources were shared. If someone in the group had a successful hunt, the meat was distributed. Not because they were saints, because in a mobile society where everyone depends on everyone else, hoarding is suicidal. The rules of sharing weren't enforced by law, they were enforced by survival. Men and women, by most available evidence, lived on more equal terms than in almost any period that followed. Both contributed to the food supply. Both had a voice. The labor wasn't divided by some rigid hierarchy, but by the practical demands of the moment. There's no archaeological evidence of systematic domination of one sex over the other in the deep Paleolithic. Children grew up in the open air, surrounded by extended family, learning by watching and doing. The elderly were honored as carriers of knowledge, the living libraries of a world without writing. The sick were cared for. The dead were often buried with care and ritual, suggesting a deep emotional and spiritual life. And the art. We often imagine that art, culture, creativity, these were gifts of civilization, that you needed agriculture and surplus and leisure to create beauty. But that's another myth. Some of the most extraordinary art ever produced by human hands was made by hunter-gatherers. The cave paintings of Lascaux, Altamira, and Chauvet, horses galloping across limestone walls, bison leaping in torchlight, handprints pressed against stone 30,000 years ago. These are not primitive scrawlings. They are masterpieces, works of astonishing sophistication, produced by people who lived entirely without farming, without cities, without written language. A people who had plenty of time, plenty of inspiration, and a deep need to make meaning from the world around them. The Paleolithic mind was not simple. It was not dulled by hardship or narrowed by survival. If anything, the evidence suggests the opposite: the cognitive demands of a hunter-gatherer life, tracking animals across vast landscapes, identifying hundreds of plants, navigating by stars, reading weather patterns, remembering water sources over territories spanning hundreds of miles, required a kind of intelligence that most modern humans would struggle to match. We have outsourced most of that cognitive work to technology. They carried it all in their heads, and they were social in ways that went far beyond our understanding. They lived in bands of perhaps 30 to 50 people, but these bands were not isolated. They were networked. They maintained relationships across vast distances, meeting other groups for trade, for marriage, for ritual, for storytelling. The shells found hundreds of miles from any ocean in inland Paleolithic sites tell us that trade networks existed long before anyone dreamed of a marketplace. These were people who valued connection, who traveled great distances to maintain it, and who understood that survival depended not just on food, but on relationships. There's something else that rarely makes it into the textbooks. These people laughed. They played games. They told jokes. They fell in love. They mourned their dead. They watched sunsets and wondered about the stars. They were, in every meaningful sense, us, the same brains, the same hearts, the same capacity for joy and sorrow and wonder. They just lived in a world that demanded less of them and gave more back. This wasn't a utopia. Let's be clear about that. Life was unpredictable. Injuries could be fatal. Conflict between groups certainly existed. Violence between males appears to be a constant throughout human history, including in hunter-gatherer societies. But these were sporadic flare-ups, not organized warfare. There were no armies, no conquest, no occupation. No one woke up in the morning and went to work for someone else. Anthropologist Marshall Sahlins called them the original affluent society, not because they had everything, but because they wanted for nothing. Their needs were modest, and the earth met those needs generously. They lived in a world of enough, and then, slowly, imperceptibly, that world began to end, not with a bang, not with a disaster, but with a subtle shift. The climate changed, the last ice age was ending, temperatures rose, new plants spread, and some humans in a few key places around the world began to do something they had never done before. They stayed, but staying came with a price that no one could have imagined, and that price would reshape every human life that followed. There's a way of telling this story that makes it sound like a triumph. Humans discovered agriculture. They mastered nature. They planted seeds, grew crops, built villages, and marched proudly toward civilization. That's the version you learned in school. It's the version that makes us feel like every step forward was a step upward. But there's another way to tell it, and this version is harder to hear. The historian Yuval Noah Harari put it in terms that shook the world when his book Sapiens was published. He called the agricultural revolution the greatest fraud in human history. And his argument was deceptively simple. We think humans domesticated wheat, but Harari says it's the other way around. Wheat domesticated us. Let that sink in for a moment. A plant, a grass, really managed to spread itself across the surface of the earth by convincing one species to dedicate its entire existence, to taking care of it. Before agriculture, wheat was a modest wild grass growing in a small corner of the Middle East. 10,000 years later, it covers millions of acres on every inhabited continent. It is one of the most successful organisms in the history of life on Earth. And it achieved that success not through its own strength, but by hijacking human labor. Here's how the trap worked. At first, it was subtle. Some group of foragers noticed that certain wild grains grew back year after year in the same spot. They started returning to those spots. Maybe they scattered a few extra seeds. Maybe they cleared away competing plants. Small actions, trivial investments. But each small action tied them a little more firmly to that patch of earth. Then came the clearing. To grow more wheat, you had to remove the rocks and the weeds. You had to dig. You had to carry water. The work increased, but so did the yield, and for a brief moment, a generation, maybe two, life seemed better. More food, more security, more people could eat. But more food meant more children survived. And more children meant more mouths. And more mouths meant they needed even more wheat. So they cleared more land, dug more irrigation channels, worked longer hours, bent their backs over the fields from dawn to dusk instead of wandering free under the sky. And then, at some point, they crossed a threshold. There were too many people to go back to foraging. The wild foods that had sustained their ancestors couldn't support a population this large. The surrounding foragers had filled every available territory. There was nowhere to go. The trap had closed. Harari describes it with haunting clarity. Each generation did just a little more than the last. Each generation thought it was making life easier. But each small improvement created new demands, new dependencies, new problems that required even more work to solve. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it was too late. The free, wandering humans had become servants of their fields, prisoners of their own harvest. This is what Harari calls the luxury trap, a pattern that repeats throughout human history. Every new convenience that promises to save time ends up consuming more of it. Every new technology that promises freedom creates new chains. We see it today with our phones, our emails, our endless digital obligations. But the original luxury trap, the one that started it all, was wheat. And this wasn't an isolated accident. That's what makes it even more remarkable. Agriculture was invented independently at least 7 times, possibly as many as 11 times, in completely different parts of the world. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, in the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys of China, in the highlands of New Guinea, in central Mexico, in South America, in sub-Saharan Africa, in the eastern United States. Different peoples, different climates, different crops, rice, maize, millet, potatoes, taro, but the same fundamental shift. And the same fundamental consequences. Why did it happen everywhere at roughly the same time? The end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, transformed the global environment. Temperatures rose, rainfall patterns shifted. New plant species spread into areas that had been frozen or barren. Suddenly, the raw materials for agriculture were everywhere. And humans, clever, adaptable, always looking for an edge, reached for them. But there may have been something deeper at play. In the Fertile Crescent, at a site called Göbekli Tepe, which we'll return to later because it changes everything, archaeologists found evidence that large gatherings, rituals, and communal feasts may have preceded agriculture, not followed it. to come together and worship something, to come together and worship something larger than themselves. Whatever the trigger, the result was the same everywhere. Humans settled down. They built permanent homes. They cleared land. They planted. And they could never go back. Consider the mechanics of the trap more closely. A forager family decides to spend an extra month near a particularly productive wheat field. They build a more permanent shelter. They store some grain for the lean weeks. They have another child, because sedentary life reduces the spacing between births. A mobile woman can realistically only carry one infant at a time, so hunter-gatherer mothers typically spaced their children 3 to 4 years apart. But a settled woman, no longer needing to walk miles every day, can have a new baby every year or two. So the population grows, and now there are too many mouths for foraging to support. They need the wheat field. They expand it. They invest more labor. They clear more forest. They dig irrigation ditches. They build walls to keep out animals. Each investment makes them more dependent on that specific piece of land. Each improvement ties them more tightly to the place. And now, consider what happens during a bad year. A drought, a flood, a plague of insects. When you're a forager, a bad season in one area means you move to another. Your mobility is your insurance policy. But when you're a farmer with a house full of children and a year's labor invested in the ground, you can't just walk away. You stay. You starve a little. You work harder. You pray. And if the bad year is followed by a good one, you breathe a sigh of relief and double down on farming, clearing even more land as a hedge against the next disaster. This is the ratchet effect. Every step forward in agricultural investment makes the next step backward. The return to foraging more difficult and more terrifying. The population has grown too large. The skills of foraging have been partially lost. The surrounding wildlands have been claimed by other groups. The trap doesn't close all at once. It closes one click at a time over generations until the people inside it can't even remember that there was ever an outside. And it wasn't just about food. Settling down changed the rhythm of human life in ways that went far beyond diet. A forager lives in the present. The land provides today, and tomorrow it will provide again somewhere. But a farmer lives in the future. Will the rains come? Will the harvest be enough? Will the grain last through winter? Agriculture invented anxiety. It created a permanent state of worry about what hasn't happened yet. The forager sleeps under the stars with a full belly and no debts. The farmer lies awake in his house, calculating, planning, dreading. The planet had supported roughly 8 million people when we were only hunter-gatherers. But the population exploded with the invention of agriculture, climbing to 100 million by 5,000 years ago. And early agricultural towns like Çatalhöyük in Turkey could house up to 10,000 people packed into rectangular houses, entered through holes in the roof. By comparison, traditional hunting and gathering communities were small, perhaps 50 to 60 people. The crowded conditions in these new settlements, combined with human waste, animal handling, and pest species attracted to the stored food, led to increased illness and the rapid spread of infectious disease. The violence intensified, too. Settled communities with stored food are targets. Nomads have nothing worth stealing, or rather, they carry everything they own and can outrun a raider. But a village with a full granary is a prize. And so, Alongside the farmers, another new figure appeared in human history: the raider, the thief, the enemy at the gate. And the need to defend against that enemy would reshape human society from the ground up. The Jared Diamond question hangs over all of this like a shadow. In 1987, the evolutionary biologist published an essay with a title that still provokes debate: "The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race." His argument was blunt. The adoption of agriculture, supposedly our most decisive step toward a better life, was in many ways a catastrophe from which we have never recovered. With agriculture came the deep social and sexual inequality, the disease and the despotism that curse our existence. Was he right? To answer that, we need to look at what agriculture actually did to the human body, and the evidence is staggering. Here is a fact that should stop you in your tracks. When humans adopted agriculture, they shrank, literally. Their bodies became smaller, weaker, and sicker. And it happened fast. In Eurasia, paleontological data shows that within just a few generations of the shift to farming, the average height of men dropped by about 6 inches. Women lost about 5 inches. Think about that. In the span of a few hundred years, an eye blink in evolutionary terms, the human body deteriorated dramatically. The tall, robust hunter-gatherer became a shorter, more fragile farmer. And it would take approximately 10,000 years until the 20th century for average human height to return to its pre-agricultural levels. That's not just a cosmetic change. Height is a proxy for overall health and nutrition. When a population gets shorter that quickly, it tells us something alarming about what they were eating and how they were living. The diet had collapsed in variety. Instead of dozens of different wild foods, each bringing its own unique set of vitamins, minerals, proteins, and fats, the early farmers ate a monotonous diet dominated by 1 or 2 starchy crops: wheat, rice, maize, potatoes. These are calorie-dense foods, which means they can support larger populations. But they're nutritionally narrow. They're heavy in carbohydrates and low in protein and essential micronutrients. A farmer eating mostly grain was getting plenty of energy, but missing the building blocks that a forager's diverse diet provided. The consequences were written on their bones. Archaeologists studying early agricultural skeletons find lines of Harris, horizontal marks on the leg bones that indicate periods of interrupted growth due to malnutrition or disease. They find dental enamel hypoplasia, grooves and pits in the teeth that form when a child's body doesn't get enough nutrition during tooth development. They find a shocking increase in cavities because the sugar in processed grain feeds the bacteria that destroy teeth. Hunter-gatherers rarely had cavities. Early farmers had mouths full of them. They find bone lesions, joint diseases, spinal problems. The phytates in cereal grains interfere with the body's ability to absorb minerals like calcium and iron, leading to weakened bones and anemia. The repetitive physical labor of farming, grinding grain, hoeing fields, carrying loads, created patterns of wear that are absent from hunter-gatherer skeletons. At the site of Abu Huraira in Syria, one of the most important transitional sites in archaeology, researchers found something extraordinary. The skeletons of women from the agricultural period showed severe damage to their knees, ankles, and lower backs. The bones were deformed by thousands of hours spent kneeling to grind grain on stone surfaces. Their toe bones were crushed and malformed from squatting. This wasn't the gentle wear of age. This was the industrial damage of labor. repetitive, grueling, body-breaking labor that started young and never stopped. And then there were the diseases. This is perhaps the most devastating consequence of all. When humans lived in small, mobile bands, infectious diseases had limited opportunity to spread. A pathogen might infect a handful of people, but the group would move on, and the disease would burn itself out. There was no reservoir, no breeding ground. Agriculture changed everything. Suddenly, hundreds, then thousands of people were living in permanent settlements, close together, surrounded by their own waste, surrounded by animals they had domesticated, sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, and those animals carried their own pathogens: smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, influenza. Today, scientists estimate that roughly 75% of all infectious diseases in humans are zoonotic, meaning they originated in or are shared with domestic animals. Think about what that means. 3/4 of every plague, every epidemic, every pandemic that has ravaged human populations can be traced back to the moment we began living alongside our livestock. The Black Death, the Spanish flu, even the recent pandemics of our own century. All of them are downstream consequences of a decision made 12,000 years ago by people who had no concept of germs, no understanding of viral transmission, no idea that the sheep and cattle they were penning next to their homes would become biological time bombs. The early farming villages were perfect incubators for disease. Dirty water, cramped quarters, poor sanitation, malnourished bodies with weakened immune systems. Epidemic after epidemic swept through these communities, killing the young and the old, weakening those who survived. Life expectancy dropped. By some estimates, the transition to agriculture shaved about 7 years off the average human lifespan. 7 years. In a world where people were already lucky to reach 40, that's a devastating loss. Jared Diamond marshaled all of this evidence in his famous essay. He pointed to the skeletal records from the Mississippi mound burials in North America, where researchers could literally compare the bones of the same population before and after they adopted maize agriculture. The decline in health was unmistakable. Shorter stature, more disease, more malnutrition, more dental decay, more evidence of physical stress. Diamond's conclusion was provocative, but grounded in data. The adoption of agriculture was, by many physical measures, a step backward, a decline, a catastrophe written in bone. But here's what makes this story truly unsettling. The physical damage was only the beginning. The real transformation, the one that would echo through every century that followed, wasn't happening in the body. It was happening between people. In the space between one person and another, something new was forming. Something that had never existed in the long equality of the Paleolithic. A gap, a distance, a hierarchy. And it started with something deceptively simple. It started with a pile of grain, stored in a room that belonged to someone. Picture this: a village, maybe 50 houses, packed together in a cluster of mud brick walls. Fields stretch out in every direction, golden with wheat ready for harvest. And somewhere in the center of this village there is a room, a granary. And inside that room, piled to the ceiling, is food. Months of food. A year of food, if managed carefully. Now ask yourself a question that would have been meaningless to a hunter-gatherer. Who controls that room? That question, who controls the surplus, is the seed from which every hierarchy in human history has grown. It's a question that couldn't exist when people were nomadic, because nomads can't carry surplus. You can't hoard 100 pounds of berries when you're walking 20 miles tomorrow. You eat what you find, you share what you kill, and you carry only what your back can bear. But agriculture created something new, storable wealth. Grain doesn't spoil quickly, especially when dried and sealed. It can last months, years. And that means, for the first time in human history, it was possible for some people to have more than others, not because they were stronger or smarter or braver, but because they controlled a room. The French anthropologist Alain Testar spent years studying this exact transition. He argued that the ability to store food was the single most transformative development in human social history. Before storage, he observed, it was nearly impossible to establish significant differences in wealth between individuals. Everyone consumed roughly the same amount because nothing could be saved. But the moment you could store food, you could accumulate. And accumulation is the foundation of inequality. The archaeologist Jean Guilin put it even more starkly. He called the Neolithic village a laboratory for the fabrication of power and the seat of inequality. A laboratory, not a paradise, not a step forward. A place where power was invented, tested, and perfected. Think about what storage required. Someone had to build the granary. Someone had to organize the harvest. Someone had to count the grain and decide when to distribute it. Someone had to guard it, because as soon as you have surplus, you have something worth stealing. And that need for protection created a new class of human being, the warrior. The appearance of the warrior class in Neolithic societies is well documented. As communities grew and stored more food, they needed defenders. Men who would stand between the grain and the outsiders who wanted it. These warriors were fed by the community, armed by the community, and increasingly honored by the community. Their job was essential, and that essential role gave them leverage, authority, status. At the same time, someone needed to manage the administration. How much grain was planted? How much was harvested? How much should be stored? How much distributed? These questions required organization, record-keeping, planning. And the people who managed these questions, the early administrators, the proto-bureaucrats, gained their own kind of power. Not the power of the sword, but the power of the ledger. The power of knowing how much there was and deciding who got what. And so the first social classes began to crystallize. Not suddenly, not all at once, but steadily. Over centuries, the flat landscape of hunter-gatherer equality gave way to something terraced, levels, layers. A few people at the top deciding, many people at the bottom producing, and a growing middle of specialists, potters, weavers, builders, priests, who were neither masters nor laborers, but something in between. A groundbreaking study led by Timothy Kohler of Washington State University, published in the journal Nature, found a remarkably simple way to measure this process. Instead of relying on grave goods, which can be ambiguous, Kohler and his colleagues measured the sizes of houses in dozens of Neolithic communities across Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas, spanning from 9,000 years ago to 1,500 years ago. Their reasoning was elegant. The size of your house reflects the size of your wealth, and what they found was devastating in its clarity. In the earliest farming communities, houses were roughly the same size. But within 2,000 to 3,000 years of adopting agriculture, house sizes began to diverge. Some got bigger. Most stayed small. and the gap kept widening century after century until the wealth disparities of the Bronze Age dwarfed anything that had come before. Interestingly, the study found a geographic split. In Eurasia and Africa, inequality continued to grow relentlessly. In the Americas, it plateaued or even decreased after a certain point. One explanation: the Old World had large domesticated animals, oxen, horses, cattle, that could be used for traction, transportation, and warfare. These animals amplified the power of those who owned them. The New World largely lacked such animals, and perhaps as a result, the runaway inequality that characterized Eurasia never reached the same extremes. But nowhere was the evidence more haunting than at Varna, on the coast of what is now Bulgaria. There, archaeologists excavated a cemetery from the Copper Age, around 4,600 to 4,200 BCE. In it, they found 294 graves, and among those graves, 6 kilograms of gold. 6 kilograms. But it wasn't distributed evenly. Most graves had nothing. A handful had modest offerings. And a few, just a few, were lavished with gold jewelry, gold weapons, gold ornaments of extraordinary craftsmanship. This is one of the oldest examples of extreme wealth inequality in the archaeological record. Some people in this community had literally nothing to take to the grave. Others were buried with more gold than most modern humans will ever touch. And this was 6,000 years ago. 6,000 years before Wall Street, before private equity, before tax havens. The machinery of inequality was already running at full speed. But the emergence of hierarchy wasn't just about who had the most stuff. It was about who told the stories, who explained the world, who stood between the living and the dead, between the community and its gods. Because alongside the warriors and the administrators, another figure was rising in these early villages: the priest, the shaman, the man, and increasingly, it was a man who claimed to understand the invisible forces that controlled the harvest, the weather, the fertility of the soil. This figure had power that couldn't be weighed in gold or counted in grain. He had the power of meaning, the power to say, the gods are pleased or the gods are angry, the power to determine who was blessed and who was cursed. And that power, in many ways, was the most dangerous of all. As the French archaeologist Jean-Paul Demoule observed, as societies developed, they created hierarchies, and their beliefs evolved in parallel. In polytheistic religions, the hierarchy among gods mirrors the hierarchy governing human society. The gods had kings, the gods had servants, the gods had favorites and outcasts. And if the divine order was hierarchical, then surely the human order should be too. Religion didn't create inequality, but it sanctified it. It transformed a man-made arrangement into a cosmic one. And once inequality was dressed in the robes of the divine, it became almost impossible to question. Let me give you a concrete example of how this worked. In the early Neolithic, every house had its own shrine. Every family performed its own rituals. The sacred was distributed evenly, just like food, just like space, just like authority. You can see this at Çatalhöyük, where the wall paintings and animal skulls and figurines are found in nearly every home, not concentrated in a central temple. But as communities grew larger and more complex, the sacred began to consolidate. A particular family or lineage might claim a special relationship to the ancestors. A particular individual might be recognized as especially skilled at communicating with the spirit world. Slowly, imperceptibly, the democratic spirituality of the early Neolithic gave way to something more concentrated, more exclusive, more powerful. And once a priestly class was established, once there were people whose full-time job was to interpret the will of the gods, those people had every incentive to make the system more elaborate, more mysterious, and more dependent on their expertise. The gods demanded sacrifices, and the priests decided what to sacrifice. The gods had preferences about who should lead, and the priests were the ones who heard those preferences. The gods punished disobedience, and the priests identified the disobedient. It's a pattern that would repeat across every civilization for the next 10,000 years. The alliance between the warrior and the priest, the sword and the scripture, the power to kill and the power to condemn. Separately, each is dangerous. Together, they are unstoppable. And there was one more element that cemented the new order, an element that is so ubiquitous today that we barely notice it, but that was once a radical and terrifying invention: debt. The moment you could store surplus, you could lend it. And the moment you could lend it, you could charge interest. And the moment you could charge interest, you could create a situation where someone who started with nothing owed more than they could ever repay. Debt is the invisible chain that turns a free person into a servant. It doesn't require violence. It doesn't require weapons. It only requires that someone with more agrees to give some of it to someone with less, with the expectation that the less will be returned with extra. We don't have written records from the earliest Neolithic. Writing hadn't been invented yet. But anthropological studies of pre-literate agricultural societies show that debt relationships were often the mechanism through which hierarchies solidified. A chief who controlled the surplus could distribute it in times of need, creating gratitude, obligation, and dependency. A family that received grain during a drought now owed the chief something in return: labor, loyalty, their son for the warrior class, their daughter for a political marriage. This is how power compounds. Not through a single dramatic seizure, but through 1,000 small transactions, each one seeming reasonable, each one tightening the web a little more, until the web is a cage, and the cage is a system, and the system is the way things have always been. The world was changing, and it was changing fast. The free, equal, wandering human was becoming something else entirely. A farmer, a soldier, a subject, a taxpayer, a believer. But this story has a twist that wasn't discovered until 1995, on a dusty hillside in southeastern Turkey. A twist that forced archaeologists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the origins of hierarchy. It was called Göbekli Tepe, and nothing about it made sense. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd walking his flock across a barren hilltop near the city of Şanlıurfa noticed something odd in the dirt. Flat stones, clearly shaped by human hands, jutting out of the ground. The kind of thing most people would walk past without a second thought. But word reached a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, who came to investigate in 1995. What he found would become one of the most important archaeological discoveries in history. Buried beneath that unremarkable hill was a monument. Not just a monument. A complex of massive stone structures circles within circles, pillars carved with extraordinary precision, standing upright like sentinels from a forgotten age. Some of these pillars reached nearly 18 feet tall. They weighed 10 tons or more. They were decorated with carved animals, foxes, serpents, scorpions, vultures, wild boar, and with subtle human features: arms, hands, belts, loincloths, and abstract and powerful, alien and strangely familiar. And they were old, incredibly, impossibly old. The earliest structures at Göbekli Tepe date to approximately 9,600 BCE. That's nearly 12,000 years ago. That's 7,000 years before the Great Pyramids of Egypt, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 5,000 years before the invention of writing. When these structures were built, the last ice age had barely ended. Mammoths may still have roamed parts of the earth. To put that in perspective, more time separates the builders of Göbekli Tepe from the builders of the pyramids than separates the pyramids from us. We are closer in time to Cleopatra than the ancient Egyptians were to the people who carved those pillars. The scale of time involved is almost impossible for the human mind to grasp. The site sits on a hilltop overlooking the Haran Plain, in a region that was once lush with wild grains, pistachios, and game. On a clear day, you can see the Taurus Mountains in the distance, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers begin their long journey to the sea. This was the heart of the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of agriculture, and Göbekli Tepe sat right at its center, like a watchtower over the birth of a new world. The structures are arranged in circles. Massive T-shaped pillars, some weighing as much as a small truck, stand in rings, connected by low stone walls and benches. In the center of each ring are two even larger pillars face each other, like sentinels guarding a sacred space. The walls between the pillars would have supported roofs, creating dark, enclosed chambers, spaces designed to separate the inside from the outside, the sacred from the mundane, the visible from the hidden. The carvings are extraordinary. Almost every pillar is decorated. Foxes curl around the stone. Snakes slither downward. Scorpions raise their tails. Vultures spread their wings. Wild boar charge. Bulls lower their horns. And among the animals, there are abstract human shapes. Arms bent at the elbows, hands reaching toward a belt buckle, fingers spread. The pillar itself seems to represent a stylized human body, with the T-shape suggesting a head in profile, perched on broad shoulders. These are not portraits. They are presences. Standing figures, frozen in stone, watching over whatever happened in the darkness of those enclosures. What happened there? We don't know with certainty. But the evidence suggests feasting. Tens of thousands of animal bones have been found at the site, mostly gazelle, wild cattle, and wild donkeys, suggesting that enormous meals were prepared and consumed. Large stone vessels, some capable of holding hundreds of liters of liquid, have been found, leading some researchers to speculate that beer, one of the earliest fermented beverages, may have been brewed here. Imagine it. Thousands of people converging on this hilltop from settlements scattered across the region, coming together to eat, to drink, to dance, to perform rituals under the stone gaze of the carved ancestors. But here's what made Schmidt drop everything and dedicate the rest of his life to this site. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not farmers. They were not city dwellers. They were hunter-gatherers, nomads, people who, according to everything archaeology had taught us, shouldn't have been capable of building anything like this. The conventional understanding had always been straightforward. First came agriculture, then came permanent settlements, then came surplus and specialization, then came monumental architecture, temples, palaces, ziggurats. These were the products of complex, hierarchical agricultural societies. You needed farmers to feed the builders, soldiers to guard the builders, and priests to tell the builders what to build. Göbekli Tepe shattered that timeline. Here was monumental architecture, built on a massive scale by people who hadn't planted a single crop, people who still hunted gazelle and gathered wild grains, people who had no cities, no writing, no metal, no pottery. Schmidt's conclusion was radical and unforgettable. First came the temple, then came the city. The conventional order was reversed. It wasn't agriculture that made civilization possible. It was something else entirely. Something in the human mind. A drive to gather, to worship, to create meaning through shared ritual. And it was that drive, that spiritual or social impulse, that may have ultimately led to agriculture, not the other way around. Think about what it takes to build something like Göbekli Tepe. You need hundreds of people working together over extended periods. They need to be fed. They need to be organized. They need to be motivated. Where does the food come from to sustain such a workforce? Perhaps some researchers speculate the need to feed large groups gathering for rituals and feasts at sites like Göbekli Tepe was the very thing that pushed nearby communities toward cultivating wild grains on a larger scale. The feast, not the famine, may have birthed farming. And indeed, this is not just speculation. Geneticists searching for the origins of domesticated wheat found that the earliest cultivated strains could be traced to a region remarkably close to Göbekli Tepe. It could be coincidence, but many researchers believe it is not. Recent research has deepened the mystery. In 2024, archaeologist Lee Clare proposed that Göbekli Tepe was built during a period he calls the crisis of the hunter-gatherers, a time when the warming climate and changing landscapes of the early Holocene were forcing traditional ways of life to transform. Though Clare suggests that three types of charismatic leaders may have emerged among these late hunter-gatherer communities: storytellers, master hunters, and ritual specialists. These weren't kings or chiefs in any formal sense. They were influential individuals whose authority came from their knowledge, their skill, or their spiritual connection. This is a critical nuance. The hierarchy at Göbekli Tepe, and there must have been some form of hierarchy to organize such massive construction, was not yet institutionalized. It wasn't backed by law or enforced by soldiers. It was organic, temporary, based on persuasion rather than coercion, a far cry from the rigid class systems that would follow. But it was hierarchy nonetheless. Someone decided what to build. Someone directed the labor. Someone performed the rituals. The site tells us something else that is deeply unsettling. At Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists found evidence of a cult of the dead. Human skulls had been removed from burials, cleaned, decorated with plaster, and incised with carvings. Some had perforations suggesting they were hung by cords, perhaps displayed, perhaps carried during ceremonies. A study published in Science Advances in 2017 documented these modified skulls, interpreting them as evidence of ancestor worship. Ancestor worship is significant because it creates a link between the living and the dead that can be used to justify power. If your grandfather built the first pillar, if your grandmother performed the first ritual, then your family has a special claim, a special status. The dead become the foundation for the authority of the living. And once that logic takes hold, hierarchy has a story to tell about itself. A story that begins in the past, stretches into the present, and demands continuation into the future. In 2025, researchers announced another remarkable discovery at the site. A life-sized human statue carved from limestone, found embedded within the wall of one of the ritual buildings. According to Professor Nexmi Karul, the director of the excavations, this was likely a votive offering, a sacred object placed deliberately as part of a ritual act. The statue's integration into the architecture suggests that the buildings themselves were not just shelters for ritual. They were ritual. The walls carried meaning. The stones told stories. The spaces were alive with belief. Göbekli Tepe was eventually abandoned around 8000 BCE. And before it was abandoned, it was deliberately buried. The entire complex was covered with earth and rubble, intentionally hidden. Why? No one knows for certain. Perhaps the old ways were being replaced. Perhaps the people who once gathered there had scattered. Perhaps the Neolithic had won, and the world of the wild hunters and their stone temples no longer had a place. The archaeologist Lee Clare offers a haunting interpretation. He believes Göbekli Tepe was the last stand of the hunter-gatherer world, a monument built by people fighting to preserve their traditions, their values, their way of life, against the rising tide of agriculture and permanent settlement. The animals carved on the pillars, wild, dangerous, powerful, were the totems of a vanishing world. And when that world finally vanished, the people buried its memory under the earth. If Clare is right, then Göbekli Tepe is not just an archaeological site. It's a tomb for an entire way of being human. But the story doesn't end there, because even after Göbekli Tepe was buried, there was one place where the old equality held on. One place where thousands of people lived together for 1,000 years without war, without poverty, and without masters. Its name was Çatalhöyük, and it is one of the most extraordinary experiments in human history. Imagine a city with no streets, no public squares, no temples, no palaces, no marketplace, thousands of mud brick houses packed so tightly together that they share walls, like cells in a honeycomb. There are no doors at ground level. To enter your home, you climb a ladder and drop through a hole in the roof. To visit your neighbor, you walk across the rooftops. The entire city is a continuous surface of flat terraces, buzzing with life under the open sky. This was Çatalhöyük. Located in what is now the Konya Plain in central Turkey, it was founded around 7400 BCE and thrived for over 1,000 years. At its peak, it housed between 5,000 and 8,000 people, making it one of the largest settlements in the world at that time. And it was, by every measure archaeologists have found, an egalitarian society. The evidence is everywhere. The houses are virtually identical in size and construction. There are no grand residences, no mansions overlooking smaller dwellings. Every family had roughly the same amount of space, the same type of construction, the same basic furnishings. If you walked from one end of Çatalhöyük to the other, climbing over rooftops, passing through shared courtyards, you would find no visible distinction between the rich and the poor, because those categories didn't exist here. Analysis of the skeletons buried beneath the floors of the houses, the residents of Çatalhöyük, buried their dead under the platforms they slept on, reveals that men and women ate the same foods and performed similar types of physical labor. There's no evidence that one sex dominated the other, no evidence of a ruling class, no evidence of slavery. The archaeological record from Çatalhöyük is, in the words of the excavation director Ian Hodder, strikingly homogeneous. The social organization was clearly egalitarian, and any tendency toward differentiation and hierarchy could not take hold. And it wasn't just equality. It was peaceful. Studies of the skeletons conducted in 2007 established that the healed injuries found on the bones were consistent with accidents, falls from ladders, occupational mishaps, not interpersonal violence. The excavation director summarized the finding with a statement that reads like a rebuke to the modern world. At Çatalhöyük, people led a life without violence. Furthermore, in 2005, researchers confirmed that no one at Çatalhöyük ever died of starvation. No war, no famine, no masters. For 1,000 years, in a community of thousands, that's not a fairy tale. That's archaeology. How did they do it? The answer seems to lie in the way they organized their lives. There was no centralized authority. Each house was a self-contained unit, a home, a workshop, a shrine, and a burial ground all in one. The elaborate wall paintings and sculptures found in nearly every house suggest that ritual and spiritual life were practiced at the household level, not in separate temples controlled by priests. Religion was domestic, personal, collective, but not hierarchical. Every family had its own connection to the sacred. The wall paintings themselves are breathtaking, geometric patterns in red, black, and white. Hunting scenes showing tiny human figures surrounding enormous bulls. Vultures swooping over headless human forms, images that have puzzled researchers for decades. Some interpret these as depictions of sky burials, a practice in which the dead are exposed to scavenging birds. Others see them as mythological narratives, stories told in pigment on plaster walls that were periodically painted over and renewed, layer upon layer, and generation after generation. Beneath the sleeping platforms of many houses, the dead were buried. Not in cemeteries, there were none. Not in special tombs, there were none of those either. The dead were placed under the floors of the homes where they had lived, wrapped in textiles, sometimes decorated with beads. Families literally slept on top of their ancestors. The boundary between life and death was not a wall, but a floor. The past was always present. The dead were always close. And over time, something fascinating happened. Genetic studies have shown that in the earliest centuries of Çatalhöyük, the people buried together in a single house were closely related. Parents, children, siblings, a biological family. But in the later centuries, this genetic closeness decreased. People who were not biologically related were being buried together. Researchers have interpreted this as evidence of a deliberate social practice. Adoption, or something like it. Families at Çatalhöyük were not just biological units, they were social ones. People chose their families. They brought in outsiders, welcomed strangers, created kinship not through blood, but through shared life. Some scholars believe this practice of adoption was itself a mechanism for maintaining equality. If one household grew wealthy while another struggled, the redistribution of people between households would rebalance the equation. It was a kind of social technology, an invisible institution, never written down, never formalized, but passed from generation to generation through practice and tradition. The ecological record is equally remarkable. Over 1,000 years of habitation, there are no signs of deforestation, soil erosion, or resource depletion. Every resource that was available when the settlement was founded was still available when it was finally abandoned. The equal organization of society, researchers believe, was the key to this sustainability. When everyone has a voice and a stake, resources are managed collectively. No one profits from overexploitation because the costs are shared. But nothing lasts forever. Around 6000 BCE, after a millennium of continuous habitation, the people of Çatalhöyük left. They dispersed into 15 or so smaller villages scattered across the plain. For another 700 years, these villages maintained strong economic ties, lived without war, and preserved elements of the egalitarian way of life. But eventually, a changing climate dried the plain, and the communities fragmented further. Some became pastoralists, wandering the landscape with their flocks. Their trace fades into the dust of history, and in the centuries that followed, the world they represented, a world where agriculture and equality coexisted, was overwhelmed by a different kind of society. A society where metal made some men richer and others poorer, where weapons made some men rulers and others subjects, where the logic of surplus, storage, and power found its fullest expression. Çatalhöyük proved that hierarchy was not inevitable, that agriculture did not have to produce kings and slaves, that thousands of people could live together, sustainably and peacefully, for centuries. But it also proved that this kind of society was fragile in the face of climate change, demographic pressure, and the relentless dynamism of human ambition. The experiment ended, and what came next was an acceleration into a world that would have been unrecognizable to the people of Çatalhöyük, a world of metal and blood. Let me introduce you to a man. We don't know his name. We never will. But we know how he died because his body was preserved in ice for over 5,000 years. And when it was found in 1991, it told a story that reaches across the millennia. His modern name is Ötzi. He was discovered by hikers in the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy. He died around 3,300 BCE, roughly 5,300 years ago. He was approximately 45 years old. He carried a copper axe, a bow and arrows, a knife, and a backpack containing food, medicinal herbs, and fire-starting equipment. He was well dressed in layered clothing made from animal hides and grass. He was also shot in the back. An arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder tells us he was fleeing when he was killed. Analysis of his wounds suggests he was struck from behind, and the blow severed an artery. He bled out quickly. He also had defensive wounds on his hands and a deep cut on his right hand, suggesting a struggle in his final moments. His was a violent death, probably a murder, possibly an assassination. But here's what makes Ötzi more than just a murder mystery. His stomach contents tell us he had eaten a substantial meal just hours before his death. Red deer meat, wild grains, traces of fern. He wasn't starving. He wasn't fleeing famine. He was a man in the prime of his life, well-equipped, well-fed, carrying a valuable copper axe that few people of his era could have afforded. This was not a random victim. This was a targeted killing. Who was he? Some researchers believe he was a community leader, a chief, a village elder, someone of authority. The copper axe alone suggests elevated status. Copper metallurgy was new, rare, and the knowledge of how to smelt and cast it was closely guarded. Others have speculated that he was a herder or a trader, someone whose travels brought him into dangerous territory. But the arrow in his back, the struggle, the deliberate pursuit across a mountain pass at over 10,000 feet of elevation, all of this points to something personal, a vendetta, a political rivalry, a struggle for power that ended in blood on the ice. And that is precisely the point. 5,000 years ago, in the mountains of Europe, people were killing each other over power. Not food, not survival. Power, status, authority, the kind of things that didn't exist, that couldn't exist, before the hierarchies created by agriculture and metallurgy. Ötzi lived at a pivotal moment in human history, the transition from the late Neolithic to the Copper Age. The world he inhabited was already deeply changed from the egalitarian communities of millennia past. He carried a copper axe, a prestige object that marked him as someone of status. He was not a common farmer or a simple herder. He was a figure of some importance, and someone wanted him dead. Researchers at the Cairn.info journal studying the origins of inequality placed Ötzi's death squarely in the context of a society in transition. The early Copper Age was a period when the old egalitarian norms of the Neolithic were crumbling. New technologies, metalworking, the wheel, the plow, were creating new forms of wealth and new forms of power. And with new power came new violence. The metallurgy of copper and later gold transformed social relations in ways that grain storage alone could not. Metal tools were more efficient, metal weapons were more deadly, and metal objects, ornaments, jewelry, ceremonial items became the first portable, durable symbols of status. You couldn't show off your grain surplus at a gathering, but you could wear a golden necklace. You could carry a polished copper axe. These objects traveled with you, and they announced to everyone you met, I am not like you. I have more. I am more. The Varna necropolis in Bulgaria, which we mentioned earlier, is the clearest early example. 6 kilograms of gold across 294 graves, distributed with shocking inequality. But Varna was just the beginning. As the Copper Age gave way to the Bronze Age, inequality didn't just grow, it metastasized. The invention of the wheel, and with it, the ox-drawn cart, the plow, and the chariot, amplified the power of those who had it. A farmer with a plow and oxen could work far more land than a farmer with a hoe. A warrior in a chariot could dominate a battlefield in ways that foot soldiers couldn't match. Technology didn't just create convenience. It created distance. The distance between those who had the new tools and those who didn't widened into a chasm. And with the plow came another transformation that we are still grappling with today: the deepening of inequality between men and women. Archaeological evidence suggests that plow agriculture, unlike hoe-based gardening, was predominantly performed by men, in part because it required the physical strength to control draft animals. As male labor became more economically central, male authority became more culturally entrenched. Societies that had been relatively balanced began to tilt toward patrilineal inheritance, patrilical residence, and patriarchal governance. The archaeological record from this period shows the emergence of fortified settlements, villages ringed by deep ditches and massive palisades. Some of these fortifications leave no doubt about their purpose. They were defensive. Warfare had become organized, not the sporadic raiding of earlier periods, but planned, sustained conflict between communities competing for land, resources, and power. And the dead tell the story most clearly. In the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, burial practices changed dramatically. Some individuals were interred with lavish offerings, ornate weapons, fine polished axes made from rare alpine stone, amber and ivory jewelry, objects in gold and copper. Others, sometimes found in abandoned storage pits, without ceremony and without offerings, seem to have been discarded. Their status, whatever it was, left no trace of honor. At the site of Bergheim in eastern France, for example, several bodies were found piled in abandoned silos. Were they slaves? Outcasts? Executed prisoners? Sacrificial victims? Archaeologists cannot say with certainty. But the contrast between these careless deposits and the richly furnished tombs found nearby speaks volumes about a world that had already divided itself into those who mattered and those who did not. Societies were organizing around the figure of the father. Archaeological genetic studies indicate that these late Neolithic and Copper Age communities were patrilineal. Inheritance and identity passed through the male line, and patrilocal, women moved to their husband's community upon marriage. Some women achieved high status, as evidenced by richly furnished female graves. But the structure of power was increasingly masculine, and it was hardening with every generation. The stelae, carved stone slabs depicting human figures adorned with weapons and prestige objects, became common in this period. They are monuments to a new kind of person, the leader, the chief, the warrior king. Figures carved with copper daggers at their belts, with solar symbols crowning their heads, with animal totems at their feet. These were not the communal ancestors of Göbekli Tepe. These were individual men, claiming authority not through community consensus, but through force, wealth, and divine right. As the French archaeologist Jean-Paul Demoule noted, as societies developed and hierarchies deepened, religious beliefs evolved in parallel. The polytheistic religions that emerged during this period featured gods arranged in hierarchies that mirrored human social structures. There were king gods and servant gods, patron deities of warriors and patron deities of farmers. The cosmic order was a reflection of the social order, or perhaps the social order was a projection of the cosmic one. Either way, the message was clear. Hierarchy is natural. Hierarchy is divine. To question the order of society is to question the order of the universe. The world of Çatalhöyük was gone. The world of Göbekli Tepe was buried. In their place stood something new, a world of sharp edges, metal edges, social edges, edges between the powerful and the powerless, the armed and the unarmed, the sacred and the profane. And over the next few thousand years, these edges would be honed into the civilizations we read about in history books. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China. Civilizations of dazzling achievement, monumental architecture, literature, law, art, science, built on foundations of inequality so deep that most people alive in those societies would never have imagined any other way to live. But before we get to the civilizations, there is a detour we need to take, a philosophical detour, because humans didn't just create hierarchies, they argued about them, they wrestled with them, and the arguments they had still shape the way we think today. long before archaeologists dug up the first Neolithic skeleton, long before anyone knew about Göbekli Tepe or the Varna gold, philosophers were already asking the question that haunts this entire story. Where does inequality come from? In 1755, a man named Jean-Jacques Rousseau published a text called The Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality Among Men. In it, he proposed an idea that was explosive for its time and remains influential today. Rousseau argued that humans in their natural state were free, independent, and essentially equal. Inequality, he said, was not natural. It was invented, and its invention was tied to one specific moment. The moment someone enclosed a piece of land, said, "This is mine," and found other people gullible enough to believe him. For Rousseau, property was the original sin, the fence, the wall, the boundary line drawn in the dirt. Once someone could claim ownership of the earth, everything else followed. Laws to protect that ownership, soldiers to enforce those laws, courts to adjudicate disputes, governments to manage the whole apparatus. Inequality wasn't a product of nature. It was a product of artifice, a social construction that served the powerful at the expense of everyone else. A century before Rousseau, another philosopher had reached a very different conclusion. Thomas Hobbes, writing in the shadow of the English Civil War, argued that the natural state of humanity was not peaceful equality, but savage competition. Without the restraining hand of authority, Hobbes believed human life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. People needed hierarchy. They needed rulers. Was chaos. And if the price of order was chaos. And if the price of order was obedience, most people would gladly pay it. These two visions, Rousseau's Lost Paradise and Hobbes's War of All Against All, have dominated Western thinking about inequality for centuries. And for most of that time, there wasn't enough archaeological evidence to settle the debate. Both sides could cherry-pick their examples and tell their stories. But in recent decades, the evidence has grown enormously, and it tells a story that is more complicated, more interesting, and more humbling than either Rousseau or Hobbes imagined. In 2021, the anthropologist David Graeber and the archaeologist David Wengrow published a book called The Dawn of Everything. It was a direct challenge to the simple narratives, both the Rousseauian fall from grace and the Hobbesian climb from savagery, that had shaped popular understanding of human history. Their central argument was that human societies have always been far more creative, experimental, and varied than the grand narratives allow. Graeber and Wengrow didn't just critique the old stories. They offered evidence of a radically different picture, but they pointed to the Wendat people of northeastern North America, who lived in large agricultural settlements, but maintained fiercely egalitarian political structures, actively debating and rejecting authoritarian tendencies. They described how indigenous intellectuals, encountering European colonial societies in the 17th century, were appalled by European inequality, and said so, eloquently and repeatedly, in ways that actually influenced Enlightenment philosophy. The idea that Rousseau invented the noble savage myth out of whole cloth is itself a myth. Real indigenous critics of European hierarchy existed, and their arguments were sharp enough to unsettle the most educated Europeans of their time. They pointed to archaeological and ethnographic evidence of societies that oscillated between hierarchical and egalitarian modes depending on the season. The same group of people might have a chief during the summer hunting season and dissolve all authority during the winter months. Hierarchy was not a permanent state, but a tool, picked up when useful and put down when not. This is a radically different image from the one most of us carry, the image of a one-way escalator from equality to hierarchy, from simple to complex, from primitive to civilized. They also pointed to societies that tried monarchy and then abandoned it, societies that deliberately created institutions to prevent the accumulation of power. Clown societies, for instance, whose job was to mock and humiliate anyone who got too full of themselves. Societies that were aware of their neighbors' political arrangements and consciously chose something different. Societies where self-consciousness about political organization was not a modern invention, but an ancient practice. In other words, hierarchy was never inevitable. Societies that tried monarchy and then abandoned it. Societies that deliberately created institutions to prevent the accumulation of power. Societies that were aware of their neighbors' political arrangements and consciously chose something different. In other words, hierarchy was never inevitable. It was always a choice. Sometimes it was a choice made under pressure, demographic pressure, military pressure, ecological pressure. But it was a choice, nonetheless. And the fact that some societies chose differently for centuries, for millennia, proves that the story is not as simple as agriculture happened and then everyone got unequal. The truth, as best as we can reconstruct it, is messier and more interesting. Humans have experimented with dozens of forms of social organization over the past 100,000 years. Some worked, some didn't. Some lasted millennia. Some collapsed in generations. The great tragedy is not that hierarchy was invented. The great tragedy is that we forgot it was invented and began to treat it as natural, inevitable, and eternal. But if hierarchy isn't natural, then what made it win? What gave it such staying power that today, in the 21st century, virtually every society on Earth is organized around some form of it? The answer lies in a combination of forces that, once set in motion, became almost impossible to stop. Let's be honest about something. If egalitarian societies like Çatalhöyük could thrive for 1,000 years, if hunter-gatherer bands could live in peace and plenty for tens of thousands of years, then hierarchy clearly wasn't the only option. So why did it become the dominant one? The first and most fundamental answer is numbers. Agriculture, for all its costs, produced more people. A lot more people. When humans were hunter-gatherers, the planet supported roughly 8 million of us. That's the total. 8 million people on the entire Earth. By 5,000 years ago, with agriculture firmly established in most of the world, the population had climbed to 100 million. Today, it's over 8 billion. That explosion was driven almost entirely by the surplus calories that farming produced. And here's the cruel arithmetic. A hierarchical society of 10,000 farmers, organized under a chief with soldiers and priests, will defeat an egalitarian band of 50 hunter-gatherers every single time. Not because the hierarchical society is better or happier, but because it's bigger. It has more hands to hold weapons, more bodies to absorb losses, more resources to sustain a prolonged conflict. Hierarchy scales in a way that equality, at least as the Paleolithic practiced it, does not. Yuval Noah Harari explained this mechanism in terms that cut to the bone. The key to Homo sapiens' dominance, he argued, is our unique ability to cooperate in large numbers. No other animal can do this. Ants cooperate in large numbers, but they follow rigid genetic programming. Chimpanzees cooperate flexibly, but only in small groups. Humans alone can cooperate both flexibly and at massive scale. But to cooperate in the thousands or the millions, you need something to bind people together. You need shared beliefs, shared myths, shared fictions, the idea of a god, the idea of a nation, the idea of money, the idea of a social class. None of these things exist in the physical world. You can't touch a nation. You can't eat a currency. You can't weigh a caste. They are products of the human imagination, what Harari calls intersubjective realities. Things that are real, because enough people agree they are real. Hierarchy, in this light, is one of the most successful shared fictions in human history. The belief that some people are born to rule and others are born to serve. The belief that the king speaks for the gods. The belief that the rich deserve their wealth and the poor deserve their poverty. These are stories, but they are stories that billions of people have lived by, fought for, and died believing. Religion was perhaps the most powerful vehicle for these stories. As societies grew larger and more complex, religious systems grew with them. The domestic spirituality of Çatalhöyük, where every home had its own shrine and every family its own rituals, gave way to temple religions managed by professional priests. And those priests, like the warriors and the administrators before them, had every reason to support the existing social order, because the existing social order supported them. And then came writing. It's one of the great ironies of human history that the technology we celebrate as the foundation of civilization was invented not to record poetry or philosophy or history. It was invented to count grain. The earliest writing systems, in Sumer, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, were accounting tools. Records of surplus, lists of debts, inventories of property. Writing gave the powerful a new way to track what they owned and what was owed to them. It made the machinery of inequality permanent, precise, and portable. And with writing came numbers, the ability to quantify, to measure, to compare. Before writing, wealth was approximate. You could see that one family had a bigger house or more livestock than another, but the comparison was imprecise, qualitative, limited by what the eye could observe. Numbers changed that. Numbers made inequality exact. They turned the vague sense that some people had more into a precise accounting of how much more. And precision, in the realm of inequality, is power. When the administrator can write down exactly how many bushels of grain each family produced, he can also write down exactly how much each family owes. And when the debt is written, it becomes real in a way that a spoken promise never could. You can deny what you said. You cannot deny what was written. This is why the earliest revolts in recorded history were often accompanied by the destruction of debt records. The Babylonians had a practice called andorarum, the canceling of debts, that was periodically proclaimed by kings, because without it, the weight of accumulated debt would crush the peasant class and destabilize the entire system. Even the rulers understood that the machinery they had built could devour itself if left unchecked. With writing came law, and the earliest written laws were not declarations of human rights. They were codes of property, contracts, and punishment. They defined who owed what to whom. They formalized the distinctions between free men and slaves, between citizens and foreigners, between the propertied and the propertyless. Law didn't create justice. It created order, and order, in a hierarchical society, primarily serves those at the top. Think about what this means. For over 200,000 years, human communities resolved disputes face to face, through discussion, through mediation, through the pressure of reputation in a small group where everyone knew everyone. Justice was personal. It was contextual. It was flexible. But written law is impersonal. It is rigid. It applies the same rule regardless of circumstance. And it is enforced not by community consensus, but by state power, by soldiers, by prisons, by the threat of violence. The codification of law was, in many ways, the final brick in the wall of hierarchy. Once the rules were written down, they became permanent, unchangeable, unless you had access to the scribes and the rulers who controlled the texts. A farmer couldn't rewrite the tax code. A laborer couldn't amend the property laws. The written word, which we celebrate as the foundation of knowledge and civilization, was also a tool of control, a way to freeze power in place and pass it down through the generations. And alongside law came something else, the concept of legitimate violence. In a hunter-gatherer band, violence was personal and immediate. One person struck another, and the community responded. But in a hierarchical state, violence was institutionalized. The king had the right to kill. The priest had the right to condemn. The soldier had the right to conquer. And ordinary people had the right to endure. This monopoly on violence, the idea that only the state can lawfully use force, is the bedrock of every civilization that has ever existed. And it was born in the same Neolithic transition that produced the granary, the warrior, and the priest. And so the Malthusian trap tightened. More people required more food, which required more land, which required more labor, which required more organization, which required more hierarchy. Each turn of the wheel produced more people and more inequality, and there was never a moment to step back and ask, is this really what we want? By the time the first empires arose, Sumer, Egypt, China, the Indus, the question was moot. Hierarchy wasn't a choice anymore. It was the water everyone swam in, the air everyone breathed, the ground everyone stood on. To imagine a world without it required an effort of thought that almost no one in those societies was equipped or incentivized to make. Almost no one, but not quite no one. Because every civilization, no matter how rigidly hierarchical, has produced its dissenters, its dreamers, its prophets of equality. From the Hebrew prophets railing against the rich, to the Greek philosophers debating justice, from the slave revolts of Rome to the peasant uprisings of medieval Europe, from the French Revolution to the Civil Rights Movement, the memory of equality has never been completely erased. It persists, it surfaces, it refuses to die. Perhaps because deep in the human genome, shaped by 200,000 years of egalitarian life, there is something that still remembers, still rebels, still believes that this is not the way things have to be. Every child who says, "That's not fair," is echoing a memory older than civilization. Every protest march, every mutual aid network, every cooperative, every union, every community garden, every act of sharing between strangers, these are not modern inventions. They are ancient echoes, the faint signal of a way of being that was the human norm for 95% of our existence, or still broadcasting through the static of 12,000 years of hierarchy. We are not wired for inequality. We are wired for fairness. We are wired for reciprocity. We are wired for trust. Study after study in behavioral economics and evolutionary psychology confirms this. When people are given the chance to divide resources in experimental settings, they instinctively move toward fairness, even when they could keep more for themselves. When they observe unfairness, shaped every institution, every economy, shaped every institution, every economy, every nation on earth. But it is not who we are, it is what we built. And like everything we build, it can be changed. And that brings us to the final question, the one that matters most. Because this story isn't really about the past, it's about right now. Let me ask you something personal. When you woke up this morning, what was the first thing you did? If you're like most people, you reached for your phone. You checked the time, maybe the news, maybe your messages. And then you got up and started doing things that other people expected you to do. Go to work, get the kids ready, answer the emails, meet the deadlines, pay the bills. Now, ask yourself, how much of your day belongs to you? How many hours do you spend doing things solely because you want to, with no obligation, no deadline, no expectation? 2 hours, 1, none? A bushman in the Kalahari worked 12 to 19 hours per week to sustain himself. The rest was his own. To rest, to play, to sit under a tree and watch the clouds, to tell stories, to be with the people he loved. You, in the 21st century, with all the technology and all the progress and all the convenience, probably work more than that bushman. And you probably have less free time. And you probably worry more about the future. This is not an accident. This is the trap. The same trap that closed around the first farmers 12,000 years ago. The same ratchet effect. Every new convenience creates new obligations. Every new technology creates new demands. Every step forward makes the step backward unthinkable. And somewhere, at the top of a hierarchy so vast and so deeply embedded that most people can't even see it, someone benefits from every turn of the wheel. That's the inheritance. That's the legacy of the seed in the dirt. Here we are, you and me, sitting in the 21st century, surrounded by the accumulated machinery of 12,000 years of hierarchy. And what does that machinery look like from the outside? The richest 26 people on Earth own as much wealth as the poorest half of humanity. Let that number settle in. 26 individuals control the same resources as 3.5 billion human beings. The richest 1% of the global population owns more than twice as much as the bottom 50% combined. These are not natural numbers. They are not the inevitable product of talent or effort or merit. They are the latest output of a system that began with a pile of grain in a mud brick room 10,000 years ago. And here's what's truly remarkable. The mechanisms haven't changed much. The granary has become the bank vault. The warrior class has become the military-industrial complex. The priestly class has become, well, take your pick, media, academia, Silicon Valley. Anyone who shapes the stories that a society tells itself about who deserves what and why. The surplus that was once measured in bushels of wheat is now measured in digital numbers on screens. The debt that once bound a farmer to a chief now binds entire nations to financial institutions. The walls that once surrounded a Neolithic granary now take the form of intellectual property, patents, trade agreements, and legal systems so complex that only the wealthy can navigate them. We live in a world where a single individual can accumulate more wealth than some countries, where the labor of millions feeds the comfort of thousands, where the gap between the top and the bottom grows wider every year, even as the total wealth of the species increases. This is not a new story. It is the oldest story, the same story that was first told in the mud-brick villages of the Fertile Crescent, now told in glass towers and server farms and satellite-linked trading floors. But here's where the story turns, because awareness is power, and for the first time in 12,000 years, we can see the full picture. The farmer in the Neolithic who worked longer hours than his foraging ancestors, who ate worse food, who lived a shorter life, who saw his children die of diseases that didn't exist before. That farmer would look at the modern world and recognize its fundamental structure instantly. Some people work, some people own, some people decide, and most people obey. The technology is different, the clothes are different, the language is different, but the architecture of power is the same. So the question becomes, are we stuck? Is this it? Is hierarchy so deeply embedded in the way we live that there's no way out? The archaeological record gives us a complicated answer. On one hand, hierarchy has proven extraordinarily durable. Every large-scale civilization in recorded history has been hierarchical. Every attempt to abolish hierarchy entirely, from utopian communes to revolutionary states, has either failed, been destroyed from outside, or recreated hierarchy in a different form. The pattern is so consistent that it can feel like fate. But on the other hand, the record also shows us Çatalhöyük, 1,000 years of peace and equality in a community of thousands. It shows us the hunter-gatherer societies that persisted for tens of thousands of years without kings, without classes, without war. It shows us the societies that Graeber and Wengrow documented, societies that experimented, that chose, that refused to accept hierarchy as destiny. Jean-Paul Demoule, the French archaeologist who has spent decades studying the Neolithic, he offered a reflection that deserves to be the final word on this chapter of human history. Technical inventions, he said, are what societies make of them. Some societies used the tools of agriculture and metallurgy to build cooperative, sustainable communities. Others used the same tools to build empires of exploitation. The technology doesn't determine the outcome. The choices do. And he added a warning that echoes across the millennia. A number of societies went into the wall through poor management of the environment. And apparently, that's what we are in the process of doing. We are the inheritors of a 12,000-year experiment. An experiment that began with a seed in the dirt and produced everything we see around us. The cities, the nations, the technologies, the inequalities, the wars, the art, the science, the dreams. We didn't choose to be born into this experiment, but we are the first generation in history that understands how it started. The Paleolithic foragers didn't know what they were giving up. The first farmers didn't understand the trap they were falling into. The builders of Göbekli Tepe couldn't foresee that their world was ending. The people of Çatalhöyük couldn't have predicted that their way of life would be swallowed by the rising tide of metal and power. But we know We have the bones and the stones and the stories. We have the data and the DNA and the deep record of 12,000 years of trial and error. We know that hierarchy is not destiny. We know that equality is not fantasy. We know that the choices we make about how we organize our societies, how we distribute our resources, how we treat each other, are not predetermined by nature or by history. They are choices, real choices, made by real people, every day. If the entire history of Homo sapiens were compressed into a single day, from midnight to midnight, we spent the first 23 hours and 54 minutes as hunter-gatherers, as equals, as wanderers in a world that provided. Then, at 6 minutes to midnight, we planted a seed. And in those 6 minutes, we built everything, and we broke everything. We built pyramids and parliaments, cathedrals and courtrooms, universities and factories. We wrote symphonies and constitutions. We split the atom and walked on the moon. We connected 8 billion minds through invisible networks that span the globe. In 6 minutes, we became gods. But in those same 6 minutes, we also invented slavery. We invented war on an industrial scale. We invented famine as a tool of control. We invented prisons, concentration camps, nuclear weapons, and the systematic destruction of the natural world that sustains us. We created a civilization of breathtaking power and appalling inequality. And we did it all because 12,000 years ago, someone decided to stay in one place and grow a grain. Here's the thing about a trap. Once you understand its mechanism, you can start to see the exits. Not easily, not quickly, not without sacrifice, but you can see them. The people of the Paleolithic didn't have a word for equality. They didn't need one. It was the water they swam in, the air they breathed. It was so fundamental to their existence that naming it would have been like naming gravity. Obvious, invisible, everywhere. We have a word for it now. We have many words for it. Justice, fairness, rights, dignity, democracy. We have the words because we lost the thing, because we have to reach for what was once simply given. And maybe that reaching, that conscious, deliberate, never-ending effort to build what once came naturally, is the defining project of the human species, not the building of cities or the splitting of atoms, but the slow, painful, unfinished work of creating a world where the dignity of every person is as obvious and as unquestionable as it was when we walked together under the open sky. The question that hangs over all of this, the question this entire story has been building toward, is not about the past. It's about the next 6 minutes, or rather, the next 6 seconds. Because the pace of change is accelerating, and the choices we make now will echo for millennia, just as the choices made in the Fertile Crescent still echo in our world today. Are we capable of building something different? Can 8 billion people find a way to live together that doesn't require most of them to serve the few? Can we take the extraordinary tools we've created, the technology, the science, the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 years, and use them to build a world that is not only powerful, but fair, not only productive, but sustainable, not only connected, but equal? I don't know. No one knows. But I know this. We are the first generation that understands the trap, the first generation that can see the full arc of the story, from the Paleolithic campfire to the smartphone in your hand. And understanding the trap is the first step toward escaping it. The people of Çatalhöyük proved that equality is possible. The ruins of Göbekli Tepe proved that the human spirit reaches for something beyond survival. The bones of the first farmers proved that progress is not always what it seems. This story is not finished. It's being written right now. By you, by me, by every choice we make about who we are to each other. So the next time someone tells you that inequality is just the way things are, that the rich have always been rich, and the poor have always been poor, that hierarchy is human nature and nothing can be done. Remember this. For 23 hours and 54 minutes, we lived differently. We lived as equals, and the bones don't lie. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If this story made you think, if it made you see the world even slightly differently, share it with someone. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think. And subscribe if you haven't already, because we have more stories like this one to tell. The past isn't dead. It isn't even past. It's right here, in every system, every structure, every assumption we carry about who deserves what. And the more we understand it, the more power we have to decide what comes next. I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious, stay questioning, and never forget that the world you live in was built, which means it can be rebuilt. Take care of each other. That's what the foragers did. That's what the people of Çatalhöyük did. That's what the builders of Göbekli Tepe did when they gathered under the stone pillars and shared meat and told stories about the world. Take care of each other. It's the oldest human technology, older than fire, older than language, older than art, and it's the only one that has never stopped working. Good night.